Hello, everyone. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and it's my pleasure to be part of the teaching lineup for this special day of giving and learning in honor of Sefirat Omer during this time when we're counting the days and weeks from Pesach to Shavuot, which we think of as the time at which we receive the Torah. And I want to actually talk about that in my class today. What is the Torah that we received, and what have we done with it? So let's just talk for a moment about this counting period. As you know, we're counting from the Exodus to, as I said, the giving of the Torah. And originally, we should know that this period of 7 weeks in the Torah had a purely agricultural significance, having to do with harvests and crops and what should happen when. And the holidays at this time also were very agriculturally oriented. They were making pilgrimages to the temple and bringing offerings. So we've layered a totally different meaning onto this counting, and it's a meaning that I really like, and I think it gives us it gives meaning to the counting, and it probably would be difficult to find meaning in the counting, counting rooted purely in agricultural cycles in the ancient land of Israel, if we didn't layer on this additional meaning. So what is it? We were free from slavery in Egypt, but the idea is we weren't freed just to live a free-for-all kind of life with no higher purpose, no structure. We were freed for in a very specific way, to come into relationship with God, to form not just a nation, but a community. And all of that is facilitated by receiving the gift of the Torah, which creates a structure for our ideals and a way of life that embodies those ideals to be established and survive. So that's what this counting is all about. It really is linking the whole purpose of the Exodus to the giving of the Torah. So let's talk about this Torah that we are so eagerly anticipating receiving. What we're building up in this counting to this height, and what actually is it that we are receiving? And is that Torah that we received on Mount Sinai, or that we imagine ourselves receiving even today on Shavuot, is it the same Torah by which we're living? Or are we doing something kind of different a few thousand years later? So the answer is both. So let's look at a text, and this text is where I got the name of this class today from. This is a midrash, Tana Debe Eliyahu, and it's a parable that gives us a certain idea of how we got from the Torah that was given on Mount Sinai to the Torah of today. So it refers to the Mishnah here, and we're going to come back to that. So there's a parable of a king with two servants, and he gives each of them a measure of wheat and a measure of flax, and departs. And the servants each make a decision about what to do with those raw materials that he gave them. So one of them takes the flax and weaves a beautiful cloth, and takes the wheat and makes it into flour, sifts it, grinds it, kneads it, bakes it, sets it on the table, and creates this beautiful presentation for the king, while the other servant just leaves the raw materials as they are. And as you can imagine, the king is a lot happier with the one who did something with the raw materials. Now, how do we understand that as being connected to Torah? So our daily Jewish lives, the practices that we live by, are not actually quite what's in the Torah. You may have noticed by reading the Torah. We have a whole lot of additional structure. We have differences, first of all, from things that are in the Torah, but also just a lot of additional structure to our lives That's not in the Torah. Take a recent example for all of us. We celebrated Pesach not long ago. So we have a Seder, we have a Haggadah, we have a whole bunch of things we're supposed to do. We drink 4 cups of wine, we ask 4 questions, we have the symbolic foods, we have to, read interpretations of the Exodus. There's a lot there. Does the Torah tell us to do all that? No, it doesn't. The Torah talks about the night of the Exodus, and it does ask us to mark an annual holiday around this. And it also does talk about teaching our children about the Exodus, and not too much more. So a lot was created that we kind of take for granted, and it's easy to see the link to the Torah, but it's not actually in the Torah. So what is it actually in? Where does it all come from? The Mishnah. The Mishnah is our earliest law code after the Torah, and there's a gap of several hundred years between those two. It's codified in around the year 200 CE by Yehuda Nasi, one of the Tanaim, or rabbi teachers of that period. And it's really important to note the year of the codification. Specifically, we need to understand it in relation to the year 70 CE, which is when the Second Temple was destroyed. So prior to the destruction of the temple, religious life was very much built around the temple. On the holidays, people were trekking to the temple and doing pilgrimages. All worship took place in the temple. There were no synagogues, there were no sidurim, there were no prayer books. Just again, the daily religious life of a Jew at that time is very different from ours. And the temple also was the communal center, the kind of the spiritual center. It played an inestimable role in their lives. When the temple is destroyed, the rabbis really have a challenge. And there are a lot of ways they could have gone, but they basically decided to reinvent Judaism. And that reinvention is codified in the Mishnah, and that forms the basis of how we live. What gave them license to just reinvent Judaism? It's a bold move, right? So let's look at how the rabbis actually describe and think of that bold move that they made in this rabbinic text. So the rabbis see what they're doing, their creativity in the early centuries of the first millennium, as deriving directly from Sinai. So this is from Tractate Avot, Masechet Avot, which we affectionately often call Pirkei Avot, the wisdom of our sages. But it's part of the Mishnah. It's different from most of the Mishnah, which is very much legal. But here and there we have some other genres of literature. And we have this very meta text in which the Mishnah is explaining the Mishnah, essentially. Rabbinic literature is explaining rabbinic literature within itself. Moses received the Torah at Mount Sinai, Moshe kibel Torah Sinai, u'misara liYoshua, and transmitted it to Joshua. Joshua transmits it to the elders transmit it to the prophets to the men of the great assembly, and so on. The Mishnah ends there, but we can read in and so on. Okay, so the rabbis see themselves and describe themselves as being part of a direct chain of transmission and doing essentially what was in that parable, right? They're taking the wheat and the flax of the Torah and turning it into something that's inherent within it, right? Sort of wheat has within it the potential to become bread, and flax similarly to become cloth. So they don't see themselves as creating something out of whole cloth, no pun intended, but really it's a kind of reworking an expansion of what was in the written Torah. And this is where we get these terms, the written Torah and the oral Torah. The oral Torah is kind of the layers upon layers of interpretation and expansion that accrue over the course of that long chain of transmission. Now, I said reworking, and that might be a word that they might have been uncomfortable with. I think from a scholarly perspective, we can see that there was a lot of reworking going on, and really much more than that. But we don't need to look askance at that. For the rabbis, it was very, very important to link what they were doing to the Torah, because otherwise they had no authority. What gave them the authority to just invent a religion and somehow claim this is what God wants us to do? The only way their system could be authoritative is if it derives from Torah. But I think, we in the 21st century, we can look at their creativity and feel great about it. The rabbis were faced with a colossal existential crisis for the Jewish people. And they said, we're going to do something new. We're going to really create a new system rooted in a pretty, interesting, sometimes tenuous, sometimes stronger, but a whole variety of ways linked to the Torah. But really, we're creating a new system to live by, so that our values are preserved and our people are preserved. And that new system is codified in the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah is bringing together a lot of legal material that is already kind of out there. Right? They didn't sit down upon the destruction of the temple and say, "What are we going to do now? Let's invent something." But rather, they had been interpreting the Torah for hundreds of years. Right? They were very much trying to live by the Torah. So there already was a lot of interpretation, even though much more happened afterwards to kind of build out a religion with a lot of elements that were not in the Torah, such as synagogue prayer, or even just the idea of daily prayer, not in the Torah. So what's out there is midrash, interpretation of the biblical text, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, in codifying the Mishnah, he pulls together kind of the legal conclusions of all of that interpretive work and organizes it so that there's a structure. There's an agreed upon body of law that all the authorities at the time agree is authoritative, and we don't just go by. We don't just have a chain of transmission, like this rabbi says this about this, and this other rabbi says this about that. We can't really live that way. We're going to kind of pull it all together and agree this is the way we live. And so he organizes the Mishnah topically, which is of course very helpful for a law code. So here are the 6 orders of the Mishnah. You might have sung about them at your Seder if you sang Who Knows One, Echad Me'odea. Shisha Sidrei Mishnah. 6 are the books of the Mishnah. So they're not just books, they're really whole sections of books. And you can see here the broad topical groupings, and then within them the types of topics that are dealt with, the areas of law that are dealt with. Now, let's just go forward a little bit and see how that process actually happened. How did they gather all of the interpretive material that was out there and distill it into a law code, right? Just, open a book, and there weren't books at the time, that's another topic, but, metaphorically open a book and it says, here's what to do. That's not the form that it was in. So how did they get from kind of interpretation of the text to a code? So I think this is just an amazing example of seeing how we got from A to B. So this is a text from the Torah in which God asks Moses to to build the Mishkan. This is the beginning of that. There's kind of an artisan appointed, but this kicks off the section about building the Mishkan, the portable tabernacle in the desert, which was kind of a temporary stand-in for a temple until they got to the land of Israel and built a temple. So I highlighted here a few words. So in the commandment to build the Mishkan, this word milacha keeps coming up. They translate it here as craft, right? And it makes sense. If you're going to build something, there's a whole lot of there's construction involved. There's all kinds of different specialties, and you know, you're physically creating something. So malacha is the word that's used. Now, in this very same chapter of the Torah, we suddenly switch topics to Shabbat. And lo and behold, the word melacha comes up again as the thing that we are not allowed to do on Shabbat. Okay, so we don't need to go into it in too much detail, but I wanted to make sure that you saw those words. So why is it significant? Because the Torah doesn't tell us much about Shabbat. The Torah says, don't do malacha on Shabbat. It mentions a couple specific things. You know, not to light a fire, not to gather sticks. That's kind of all we get. And we have the double portion of manna that falls on Fridays, so we don't need to, so the Israelites didn't need to gather it on Shabbat. That's not a whole lot of instruction about how to keep Shabbat and how to, as the Torah does say, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. How do we do that? Just by not gathering sticks? It doesn't seem sufficient. So the rabbis ask themselves, how do we flesh out this word melacha? How do we know the things that we're not supposed to do on Shabbat? And as you just saw in that text from Exodus, the commandment to build the Mishkan, it comes immediately before the commandment to keep Shabbat, and the same word is used. So the rabbis used a midrashic technique, an interpretive device called svichut parshiot, which basically means one thing coming right next to something else. And they say the malacha here must be the same as the malacha there. What does that mean? The work that we're not supposed to do on Shabbat, it must be all the things that they did do to build the Mishkan. And they had a variety of interpretive devices like this that they used to, again, get from A to B, kind of turn the often, sort of minimal instruction in the Torah into a system to live by. And we can actually see, if we, again, fast forward several hundred years, we can see what this looks like in the Mishnah. So the Mishnah in Shabbat categorizes all of that work that was done to build the Mishkan. It goes painstakingly, the Mishnah doesn't, but the prior material goes painstakingly through the Torah to see what were all the labors that were involved in building the Mishkan. And it gives us this very straightforward list. These are the 39 things, 40 minus 1, the milachot, using that same word, that we're not supposed to do on Shabbat. Now, then, of course, there's a lot of explanation of what each of these means, how it applies. But that's the work of the Mishnah, gathering the interpretation into something concise to live by. I want to show you one other another Mishnah that I think nicely illustrates this A to B move as well. So this is actually the very first Mishnah in all of the Mishnah. When we say we have the orders of the Mishnah, within them tractates, within them chapters, and within them Mishnayot. So one unit of text is called a Mishnah within the larger Mishnah. So this is the very first Mishnah. It asks, from when does one recite the Shema in the evening? And they answer it in various ways. So one has to do with the timing of when the priests ate their portion that was donated for them by the Israelites, and then other answers have to do with how far have we gotten through the night? They divide the hours of the nights and days in a certain way, but until halfway. And the third answer is until dawn. So let's just pause to notice how much isn't in the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't say there's a commandment to say the Shema in the evening. It assumes that. It doesn't have any biblical verses telling us the Shema, telling us we're supposed to say it, right? It says in Bafta, you should say it when you lie down and when you wake up. They're assuming we know that. And they're just taking the conclusions and they're not presenting it as interpretation of a biblical text. So I just wanted you to see that shift. You only can arrive at this kind of text by following through the text of the Torah having been interpreted over time into some clear instructions. So that's one piece, just to kind of see how the Mishnah has embedded within it all of these decades and centuries of interpretation and how to live out the Torah. Another thing I wanted you to see about this Mishnah is the idea of machloket, of disagreement. And it's an amazing thing about the Mishnah that becomes so defining of Judaism, and it's really something to celebrate, which is that we have accepted from the very beginning of when we started approaching law in an organized way that there are multiple opinions and multiple opinions are valid. The Mishnah doesn't say Rabbi Eliezer said this, the majority said this, Rabbi Gamliel said that, and here's the one that's right. It very specifically does not do that. And you'll find this all over the Mishnah. Very often a majority view and then a named rabbi, but often even more views than that. There's total comfort with the idea that there are different valid interpretations of Torah. And there's so much in that sentence that I just said, but it's really words to live by. And it's something that we should, I think we have as a people striven to integrate into our approach to Jewish communal life, but maybe even becomes more and more urgent over time, because there really are diverging ways of understanding Judaism, of understanding Torah, and it takes work to kind of embrace an approach other than your own as valid. But that is right here in the Mishnah from the very beginning. And the third thing I wanted to point out about this Mishnah is the story. So Rabbi Gamliel's sons went out late drinking. They came home and they said, oops, we didn't say the Shema. And he says, the dawn hasn't, it's not dawn yet, so go ahead and say it. So it's just a simple story, and it just backs up the law that was already stated in Rabbi Gamliel's name. But I think it's a nice illustration of how story is actually a feature of the Mishnah and of rabbinic literature in general, and a maaseh shaya, something that happened, brings a certain authority to it. So the primary authority of all of this is sort of rooting it back in the Torah, but kind of seeing how something is practiced for real and what a figure of authority said in the face of a real situation, a question, what should I do, has real weight, and such stories are integrated into the Mishnah. So those two Mishnayot, the Mishnah from Masechet Shabbat that gives us the 39 forbidden labors on Shabbat, and then that small piece asking in Masechet Brachot, the tractate on blessings and prayer, when to say the Shema, that gives us a taste of the different ways in which what becomes really the bedrock of Jewish practice is I was going to say rooted in Torah, but it might be that rooted is too strong a word. There's like a thread that we can see, and maybe not more than that. I don't know. If we had Q&A, I'd be very curious to hear what you think about those 39 malachot of Shabbat. Is it rooted in Torah? Is it too tenuous? But this was the project the rabbis took upon themselves to save Judaism and again to build a structure of meaning. And it's worth mentioning with the Mishnah from Brachot in particular, or really just about that whole tractate of the Mishnah. Again, there was not prayer. Regular prayer was not a feature of Jewish life before the destruction of the temple. There was ritualized cultic worship in the temple, and the rabbis came up with blessings. There are no blessings in the Torah at all. We have, at least in the Torah, sort of moments of individuals that maybe look a little bit like prayer, and the rabbis try to root the three statutory services of the day, Shachrit, Mincha, Mariv, in those episodes. But so let's say at least we have some prayerful moments in the Torah, but there's certainly no kind of ritualized prayer, and blessings just don't exist at all. The idea that before you eat, you say a blessing, or after you eat, you say a blessing, or before performing mitzvah, you say a blessing. The rabbis, they invented it. They really did. Even if, maybe they wouldn't like to use that word. But what an amazing invention, right? To have a system that reminds us as we go through our daily lives, this is a holy moment. Right? I'm getting this food. Hamotzi lechem min haaretz. I'm getting this food from from a source more powerful than me. And I think the brachot in general, and prayer in general, it kind of prompts us throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the year, to think of ourselves as being part of something larger. The meaning doesn't start and end in our own individual lives. So I want to show you one more Mishnah that I just happen to love. And if you ask me what my favorite Mishnah is, it would be this one. I don't think most other people have this as their favorite Mishnah, but this is mine. So this is not so representative of the Mishnah. As we said, it's a lot of law on a lot of topics, that I showed you in that listing of the six orders and the tractates within them. But here's another moment where the rabbis kind of step back and they actually ask the question that I was articulating a minute ago. Is it a root? Is it a thread? How connected really is what we're doing here to the source of it all? And look at what they say. So they're looking at different areas of law, of halakha, and asking what the connection is. So they start out with this wild statement. This area of heter nizarim, the dissolution of vows. Vows were a really big deal in ancient times, even though they're not a big feature of our lives today. They basically say, look at what they say. It's flying in the air. They have nothing to support them. We made it up. It really says we created this, almost out of whole cloth. Let's go a little further. The halachot of Shabbat, festival offerings, misuse of consecrated property. Again, we should note consecrated properties set aside for the temple. So they did actually, there was a lot of law that they were working through that related to the temple, and we could have a whole other class thinking about why that was, because it all is in the wake of the destruction of the temple. There is no temple anymore. Putting that aside, so Hilchot Shabbat, we looked at that together a little bit. The festival offerings, these other areas, these are like mountains suspended by a hair, as they have little written about them in the Torah, yet the details of their halachot are numerous. So I read this as them saying, this is so tenuous, and that could be a positive statement or a negative statement. So saying that the connection between these mountains of law about Shabbat and the very brief prohibition against doing work on Shabbat that's in the Torah, saying that it's like a mountain hanging on a hair, you could see that as undermining the validity of it. That's one way of looking at it. Or you could see it as just a self-consciousness in a good way, and really a celebration of how creative the rabbis have been, what they've, where they've gone with the minimal material that they got, with the raw materials that they got. And finally, the halachot of monetary law, sacrificial rights, ritual purity and impurity, forbidden sexual relations, all have something to support them. These are the essential parts of Torah. So these areas of law, there's a ton in the Torah, and if we had more time, I would have showed you some other Mishnayot, some other sections of the Mishnah that very clearly, much more clearly than what we've looked at, derive from the Torah. There's in Parshat Mishpatim, for example, there's extensive material on damages. Your ox falls into my pit. I hit you, whatever it is. But things that happen in normal interactions between people. They happen then. They happen now. They happened in biblical, rabbinic, and all times since. So there's a whole section of the Bible on that, and a whole section of the Mishnah, but it's quite directly connected. But they're naming that difference. They're saying there are areas of the Torah that gave us a lot of raw material, and what we've done, you can see plainly, is rooted in the Torah. And then the areas where we've been more creative. And then these other areas where we've been super creative, really creative. So let's actually just look back at that very first text, because it kind of encapsulates where we wound up. Okay, so we have the author of the text being encountered by a person along the way, saying, what's the deal here? The Torah, the written Torah, is what we got on Mount Sinai. All this other stuff that we live by, that's based in the Mishnah, that's not from Sinai. And the rabbi answers him, they all come from the mouth of God, and that's where our parable came in. So it's kind of two different images: the flax and the wheat being turned, from raw material into something wonderful and usable, both of those things. And then these other images at the end, sort of asking, how far have we come from the raw material? Part of what I love about the Mishnah is that it's just unabashed about the fact that we need to keep building out Torah. We can never just stop with what we have. There are always new challenges to face, new questions, and new time periods that we're in that cause us to see Torah differently. So the Mishnah really establishes, it doesn't just lay out a body of law for us. It doesn't just codify the law and tell us how to live. It actually establishes a whole concept of giving ourselves license to be creative and to build out Torah. And I would be remiss if I didn't connect that back to what we do at JTS, where we're teaching our students the raw material. Now, the raw material, there's a lot more of it than there was then, since now all this other material has become part of our canon. We're teaching them the raw material, but we never just tell them to stop there, right? We expect our students, and we give them the tools to create with it, to go out into the world, whether it be as rabbis and cantors, or as scholars, or as lay leaders, to take the Torah, to bring it into their time, and to create a beautiful and usable and livable and wonderful system out of it. It might be an interpretation that's just squarely right there. I can see how it roots back immediately, and it might be one of those hanging by a thread, or floating in the air moments where more creativity is called for. But that is all fundamentally part of Judaism, part of our text, part of how we live, and very much part of how we train future leaders of the Jewish community at JTS. So I hope this little taste of the project of the rabbis in transforming the Torah 2,000 years ago inspires you to see all of us as being part of that, see the leadership training that's happening at JTS as absolutely crucial to that project of creating a living Torah, and hope you support us. And more importantly, I hope that in a few weeks you have a wonderful Shavuot where you have your own experience of receiving and interpreting the Torah. Thanks so much for joining me.